let me introduce myself again for those of you who may not remember. I am Dr. Lauren Wilner. I'm a faculty member in the School of Social Work at San Diego State University. And I focus on a couple different things in my role there. So I teach macro social work, which basically means administration, management, and leadership and policy. And so I do all things macro social work and teach our students who are interested in that. And then I also do a lot of anti-racist educating and pedagogy work, which is how I come to this work with the academy. I do trainings with them and try to do a lot of outside beyond the classroom, create spaces for people to be having these conversations, critical conversations around what it means to create racial justice within organizations in a real, legitimate, deep, and lasting way. And I say that because there is a difference between doing racial justice work that is in response to a particular event or a moment in time, and racial justice work that is both systematic and systemic. And part of what I really like to do is help leaders and people working in human service organizations and nonprofits to really think about what it means to actually do this work in a sustainable way that makes a difference in organizations. I'm also an organizational scholar with a focus on social welfare organizations. So my research focuses a lot on creating equitable organizational systems, generally speaking. Okay, so today we are going to talk about what it means to actually create and have a racially just organization. And for those of you that attended the trainings before, these concepts and these terms will not be entirely new to you, but we are going to try to go a little bit more in depth into what it looks like from a leadership perspective, and how to think about being a leader in your organization and doing this work and what your specific role is. So some of the things we'll discuss this morning are the importance of history. I like to talk about history. One, I love history in general, but I also think rooting this work in history is actually really important, because I find that people don't often know history or the history surrounding why we need to even do this work to begin with, right? Like, what is it that has led to this moment in time that we need to continue to be thinking about how to create spaces and organizations that are not racist, right? Why are we still existing in these spaces that are racist and unjust and oppressive? So while we could spend hours and hours talking about the history of racism in this country, we'll touch on it very briefly just to give some context. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what actually makes a racially just organization versus an organization that is simply trying to address some issues kind of on the periphery. What does it look like for this to be both systematic and systemic? And then we're going to talk about the role of leaders specifically, which we've talked about before, but we're going to go in depth into a couple of ways that you can really start to go more deeply into this work in your leadership role and what it looks like for you to be a leader versus somebody who's doing this work in another type of position in an agency. Some common mistakes that I often see leaders making, that I've made myself, that people make all the time, and then thinking about how to get started. And I want to really make this point that we are talking about how to get started, because this is a very, very long journey that starts somewhere but doesn't actually ever finish. And so thinking about how we get started is really important, and rooting ourselves in that space of getting started versus what do we do and how do we achieve whatever ends we are trying to achieve. So kind of slowing things down a little bit, right? And, we often hear things like trust the process. This is one of those things where you need to get started and trust the process. And then at the end, we'll talk a little bit about, well, where do we go, right? Again, this is a start. You're not going to leave this webinar sadly, with all of the information that you need, you might feel like you, again, are just getting started and you don't know that there's so much more to know. And that's because there is, right? So each effort that you make, each webinar you attend, each training you attend, each conversation you have is just one more piece of the work that you are doing and the work that you are building and your own learning and your own growth. So hopefully we can, that's the framing of our work together this morning. Okay, so first, a story. So hold on one second, let me go back. So I like to tell people a little bit about how I got to this work. So a couple of things I want to touch on. The idea that empathy is not enough, right? So we can be caring. We can care about the impact of racism on those who are most affected, but caring is not enough. Caring doesn't lead to change. Caring doesn't lead to justice. And the story that I'm going to tell you is, you'll see why I'm saying that. So ignorance is definitely bliss. It is really easy, especially where you are in a position of privilege. But even for those who do not hold racial privilege, it's easier and more comfortable to stay unaware. That is something that I think people are constantly grappling with when doing this work, is this idea that, it's really painful depending on where you sit in this puzzle. It can be really painful to sit and talk about this and to try to make changes in this area. And so ignorance really is often much more comfortable and much more blissful than actually doing this work. And the learning is lifelong. There is a starting point, but there is never, ever an end to the learning, right? As long as we live in a racist society, as long as we continue to deal with injustice based on race and other forms of repression, there's never an end to our learning, and it is constantly evolving. So this is me as I'm graduating from undergrad. In 2000, I graduated in 2004, but the story really begins in 2002 when I took a class. So I went to the NYU Gallatin School of Individualized Study, which is a small liberal arts college within NYU. So it's a big university, but I actually didn't really feel that because I was in this small program where I got to create my own major. And my major was based on, was two strands of interest. So first, I had come into school with an interest in photography and wanted to be a photojournalist. That didn't quite pan out, although I still do lots of photography. But I wanted to do photojournalism and to be a social change documentary photographer. But I was also really interested in issues of oppression, generally speaking, but race and based on race and gender. And so what I graduated school with was a degree in the intersections of feminism, race, and class. And so what does that mean? Well, it means that I spent my entire academic career at NYU really delving very, very deeply into the issues of race and class within the feminist movement, broadly defined, but most specifically second wave and third wave feminism. And I got to go to this program that really allowed me to create a program that focused on this. And in 2002, I enrolled in this class called The Politics of Experience, Women of Color. And this course was fundamental to who I was going to become, not just as a student at NYU, but a student in the future, as a social worker, as a woman, as a feminist. I had no idea that it was going to be so fundamental. And the course itself was based on this essay called The Evidence of Experience by Joan Scott. And this course, as the title suggests, was about the experience of women of color, right? And here I was in this class, and I am very much a white woman. And I was one of a few white women in this class. And I thought at the time, well, how great is this that I put myself out there and I enter spaces where I might not be so comfortable, right? That was the perspective that I brought to this at the time, right? And it became very quickly became clear to me that I was operating from a place of ignorance, from a place of privilege, and that I was really going to have it handed to me, so to speak. And this was one of the hardest but most important experiences of my adult life, because I was in this class and I committed one of the very quintessential acts, I guess. I don't want to call it a sin, but an act of somebody like me at the time, a young, privileged white woman who wanted to understand the experiences of people of color, right? And so I'm in this class and I'm, again, ignorance is bliss, and I'm asking questions and I'm making all sorts of statements about how I want to be involved and how I want to support, women of color, and how I want to be a better feminist and all of this. And at one point, and I don't remember exactly what it was that I had said, but one of the students turned around and looked at me point blank in the face and said, "It is not our job to teach you about your racism." I'm going to repeat that. It is not our job to teach you about your racism. And in that moment, aside from feeling embarrassed and ashamed and upset and affronted and offended and all of those things that young white people, not just young, but especially young progressive white people will feel when they're being called out. I realized that I was going about this all wrong. And it took a long time for me to really kind of come to an understanding of that. But it was that moment where I realized there is no end to this journey. This is a start, and this is a lifelong learning process. And ever since that moment, which was really pivotal for me, I took a different approach, although not immediately. I had to sort of pick myself back up off the floor a little bit and come to it, but realize that I had a lot of privilege and I had no idea how that privilege showed up in the space and what that meant for me and what that meant for people that I was working with, that I was in community with, that I was in classes with. And it really was a turning point. And I say this because I think a lot of people can identify a moment where things shifted, where you had, especially those of us who come from certain amounts of privilege, right? Where things shifted for you, where you were given an opportunity to learn, where somebody called you out and you had a choice. You could either become defensive and be offended and stay in that space and operate from that, or you can take a step back and act with humility and commit yourself to learning. And in that moment, I committed myself to learning, and I am still learning, right? And I get to give these webinars and these presentations and do trainings and teach social work students. And every day I'm still learning, right? I'm, 20 years down the line, and I still consider myself a lifelong student of this, because of the fact that no matter what I do, I still walk into a space with an amount of privilege that allows me to take up space in a way that other people can't, right? And that is really important. And I say all of this to hone in on the point that, again, this is a starting point. This is a lifelong journey of learning and of messing up and of making mistakes and of being called in, right? And sometimes being called out, as I was. So something that I committed to, and also and continue to be committed to, and think is really important, is thinking about the history, and not just the history of of slavery in our country. We've all hopefully learned some about that. We know that our history is history we're taught in school, especially for those of us who are a little bit older at this point, may not be accurate history, may be whitewashed history. But I think we generally have an understanding of the fact that we are a history of oppression, right? That our country is built on, literally built on slave labor, right? But it's really important when we're thinking about racial justice to go back to this and to understand not just that we have this long history of racial injustice, but that the history itself is why it is so incredibly hard to achieve racial justice in this country, and why, and this may be a controversial perspective, why we may never actually fully achieve it, because it is so very much baked into who we are as a society that it requires so much undoing and unraveling of things that people are just not willing to undo and unravel. So, very briefly, because this is not a webinar on history, many of you have probably heard of the year of 1619, and there is some argument around whether or not this is actually the year that slavery began in earnest in our country, but it is known as a year where things changed, right? The first slave ship arrives with a lot of people in 1619 in Jamestown, Virginia, beginning in earnest the transatlantic slave trade, where 12 million Africans are transported to America to work on plantations over a period of 366 years, right? So it begins in the mid 15th century, which is before 1619, begins in earnest in the early 1600s, and actually lasts through the 1860s. I want you to just kind of sit with that for a moment and think about what that means, right? The entire time this is happening, we are building a nation. We are separating from another country to become independent, and we are building a nation. And the entire time we are importing human beings to do this, right? This is a serious legacy that we have. So to skip a whole bunch of this history, obviously, to kind of sum it up, we've got 1619, the slave trade begins in earnest. It isn't until 1816 that abolition really starts to take hold, right? And abolition starts actually in France and in England, the abolitionist movement. But it isn't really until 1816, something called the American Colonization Society, that we start to really think about what it means to abolish slavery in this country. That's over 200 years before we are publicly taking a stand, and this is not everybody, but publicly taking a stand to abolish slavery in this country. That is a very, very long time before people started to say this is not okay. So we get to 1865 and we have the 13th Amendment, slavery is abolished, right? But as we all know, slavery, even though we abolished institutionalized legal slavery, we know that from 1865 until 1964, so 100 years, that we have the Black Codes, which start right in 1865, which basically allow for the continued segregation and discrimination against people based on race, and Jim Crow, right? Which is some of the most violent and horrific acts of racism in recent history, right? In 1954, we have Brown versus the Board of Education, the first major piece of legislation outlawing segregation in our education system. And then we have the Voting Rights Act in 1964. I'm sorry, this is a mistake. In 1965, and then we have the Fair Housing Act in 1968. So this is some history. And I want to show you this image, because this is an image, as somebody who loves photography and studied photography, photojournalism. This image is one of the most poignant images for me personally of the civil rights era, the most recent civil rights era in 1950s through 70s, right? And this is an image that many of you have probably seen. It's an image of a young 15-year-old boy being attacked by police dogs in Birmingham, Alabama during the Children's March that was taking place. So just look at this image for a minute. This is not that long ago, right? And now look at this image. And this is in 2020, right? And so this is also an image that I think is extremely powerful. It's in San Jose, also in May of 2020, around the time that George Floyd was murdered and the protests were happening in our country around Black Lives Matter. And these images are, while she is not being assaulted by police dogs, these images are not actually that different from one another, right? And this is all to say that we have not actually come that far, right? And we continue to operate in a space where violence against people of color is both acceptable and sanctioned. And all of it is rooted in the history of this country, right? And so when we think about why it is so very difficult to achieve racial justice and what that even means, we cannot not think about how embedded, how baked in all of these ideologies, right? The ideology of racism, the ideology of white supremacy, which is really what we're going to talk in depth about today, is baked into who we are as a nation and who we are as citizens of this nation and who we are as communities and as people who are trying to make a difference in the world through the work that we do and as organizations. And the real bottom line about it is that there's no getting around it, right? And we can't opt out of it. We can't opt out of understanding that this is who we are. And we have two choices. We can either reckon with that and move forward and take actionable steps to remedy the situation as best as possible, or we can ignore it. Those of us that can ignore it are those of us with privilege. Those who can't ignore it are the ones who live the impacts of this every single day. So what does that mean? Well, it means we have a lot of work to do. It can feel overwhelming. It is not impossible, but it can feel very, very daunting, especially when we are in this environment now where we have to be talking about this as leaders in organizations. It is no longer acceptable to ignore it, right? And if we're not talking about it, then we may get called out on that too. And so we are being forced to reckon with this, but so many people, and this is not just people who have privilege, this is not just white leadership, this is all leadership, right? Because we all exist in this very racist, racially unjust system and society, we are all impacted by this, and we are all part of perpetuating it in some way, shape, or form, which we'll talk about, but we have no choice but to deal with it. Oops, sorry. So where do we begin? Well, I think there's a lot of places to begin, right? There's no one place to start, but we have to pick something, and we have to start somewhere. So one of the things that I like to really hone in on as we think about this history and what our country actually is built on is that there is an assumption built into the founding of our country and subsequently who we are as a nation that some people deserve more power rather than others, right? Some people deserve more power than others simply for existing, simply because they were born into a certain space and time and have a certain positionality. the more privilege you have, the more power you are seen as being deserving of, right? And so this is different than having power, right? If you are seen as deserving of power, you likely have more power, right? But this concept of deserving, right? We think about, we often think about in social work and in providing social services, right? The deserving versus the undeserving, right? This is a concept that we talk a lot about, right? But we don't necessarily think about it in terms of power, and that this is fundamentally a part of who we are, that as a society, we operate on the assumption that some people deserve more power than others. And everything we do winds up being based on this, whether we know it or not, right? And so once we start to understand this, it really kind of starts to unravel how we think about this, right? That if some people are just automatically deserving of more power than others based on their race, that, and for nothing that they've done, nothing that they've earned, right? Nothing they've achieved, just simply by being born, then we have a really, really hard uphill battle of dismantling that ahead of us. It's not impossible, but it is a long uphill battle, right? And so one of the challenges to this, right, is figuring out how to act on this. What do we do about this? So we wind up in this space of all talk and no action, right? And so we try to understand, as I did 20 something years ago, sitting in a class saying, I want to learn, I want to listen, I want to understand, right? But listening and learning without action is meaningless. And not only is it meaningless, it's harmful, right? Because you are extracting people's emotional labor and using it to your advantage by simply listening and learning and doing nothing about what you have just learned and what you have been told. It is emotional labor for somebody to sit and talk about how they experience racism and oppression with you if you are somebody who does not experience the same racism and oppression, right? You do not experience that conversation in the same way that the person who is telling you about their experience does. And you can think about it in terms of any difficult situation that you've encountered in your life, any trauma, right? Racism is trauma and racism is violence. And any trauma that you've experienced, if you are telling somebody about it, they are listening, they're learning, but they likely can't understand exactly what you've been through. And it's also way harder for you to talk about that trauma, that experience, than it is for that person to sit and listen. Again, racism and oppression are trauma and they are violent, right? And so when we sit and we listen and we learn, which is very important, but we do not do anything after having sat and listened and learned, we actually are becoming part of, we commit the same violence essentially by not acting, right? By not thinking about, okay, what do I do with this information? Then you are very frankly, committing a violent act, essentially. And I know that may seem harsh, right? But when we think about trauma, racial trauma as violence, then not doing anything about it is really kind of part of that violent system. So I want to pause here and see if anybody, I'm not monitoring the chat because of my screen. Is there, I'm looking at it now. Is there any questions or any comments before we move forward into thinking about what this looks like in organizations? Any thoughts? Feel free to type it in the chat. And no? Okay, well, I will periodically look at the chat, so feel free to put questions in there and we can try to address them at the end too. Okay. So what does this look like? How does this all play out in our organizations? Well, first, and if we've talked about this before in other trainings, what is a multicultural versus a racially just organization looks like, but I really want to kind of hone in on what this actually looks like in practice when we're thinking about the history and we're thinking about the perpetuation of trauma and violence that comes with racist systems and structures. What does it look like to not be that type of organization, right? What does it look like for the system to be different? So it's not just what it looks like, but it's also how organizations act, right? So we can think of an organization as a unit that actually that creates action, right? That can engage collectively, right? Organizations are made up of people, and collectively we can engage in certain acts, right? So what does it look like when we are not just listening and learning, but we are actually acting on this? So it looks like a lot of things, but these are 5 of the primary ways that we can think about acting in a racially just way within our organization. So we've got personal and collective knowledge acquisition regarding racism and other forms of oppression, right? So that means doing the learning individually and collectively as an organization, right? Constantly, ongoing, and as part of the work, right? It is not an add-on. It's not a book club. It's not a text stream talking about some things that you've learned, in reading a book. It's part of your day-to-day work. It's built into the organization, to the tasks that everybody needs to do, and understanding that collective knowledge acquisition regarding racism and oppression is part of doing our work, just like any other piece of the work that you do in the organization. When we think of it that way, it becomes systemic, right? Just like case management is a systemic part of our organizations, just like providing therapy and counseling is a systemic part of our organizations, just like applying for grants and funding and contracts, the systemic part. The personal and collective knowledge acquisition has to become a systemic part of the organization. An organization that is racially just is going to engage in anti-racist analysis that is rooted in history and the current states of racism and oppression, right? There, like we said before, there is no end to this, right? As long as we exist in a racist and oppressive society, which this doesn't seem to be ending anytime soon, then we have to continue engaging in analysis around these problems, right? That both acknowledge the history, that you can't just upend 500 years of racist policy and practice, right? Just because we decide we don't want to exist in this type of society anymore doesn't mean that it just ends. So it's rooted in the history, and it's also rooted in the current state of what's happening, right? So anti-racism is a process and not the goal. And this, I think, is one of the most important things to understanding what it looks like to create a racially just organization, and from a leadership perspective, right? As leaders, we often want to make the change, make things better as quickly as possible, right? And we'll learn why this is not only not possible and problematic, but actually rooted in systems of white supremacy, this idea that we can actually achieve this goal and we want to do it quickly and cleanly and, move on, right? It's not possible, right? Being anti-racist and being anti-oppressive is a process that continues and it never ends, and it's built into everything that you do, right? There is no goalpost. As long as racism is present in society, we will be doing anti-racist work. That's just the reality. Until it is no longer an issue in our country and in our world, then we have work to do. And so this is a real shift, I think, for people, especially as we are trying to really step into this space of doing anti-racist work becoming an anti-racist, racially just organization, right? It's a real shift that it starts, but it doesn't end. And you will continue to hear me say this because it is the point. If you leave with one thing today and only one thing, it's that this work is never over until we no longer have racism in this country and in our world, which we all know is unlikely, unfortunately, but that's the reality. And a racially just organization is going to take both inward and outward facing anti-racist stances. So what does that mean? It's not just about being anti-racist internally. It's not just about creating spaces that are inclusive and just for our employees, but it is also about what you do as an organization in the community and for the people that you serve, right? So if we are trying to create spaces that are racially just internally, but we are adhering to potentially racist and oppressive policies and practices towards our communities that we serve, then we cannot be a racially just organization, right? And that takes a lot of reflection, self-reflection individually, but also as an organization to think about what are we doing as an agency? What type of practices do we engage in? What policies do we adhere to, right? What perspectives are we proponents of? And are they potentially reinforcing systems of racism and oppression? So these are both inward and outward facing processes. And you cannot be a racially just organization if you only have one, right? So if you're taking a anti-racist stance towards the people that you work with and really trying to be progressive in that respect, but you're not thinking about the way that racism is reproduced within your organization, then you're missing 50% of the work. So as you've likely heard me say before, this starts and it ends with leadership. It's a pretty big burden to bear, but if you are going to be a leader in your organization and you're going to have a racially just organization, it starts with you. You set the tone, right? Just as you do for everything else in the organization, right? Everything starts and ends with the tone that leadership sets. If you are taking this work seriously, it signals to the rest of the organization that it's something that needs to be taken seriously. And how you do this, there's many ways to go about taking this seriously and setting the tone. But first and foremost, it has to start with the leadership, with the people at the top, because otherwise you are saying that it's for everybody else to do, but not you, right? And that never really goes over well with people. So the other piece of it is that it is really not the responsibility of your employees, especially BIPOC individuals. They're not responsible for initiating and leading this work, right? It is, as somebody who is at the helm of the agency, is responsible for the agency in a variety of ways. This is just one more thing that you are responsible if you do in fact want to have a organization that is racially just. It is one more thing that you are responsible for creating the systems to make it happen, right? And it doesn't mean that you yourself as an individual are the one that has to do all of it, right? But the responsibility is not for the people at the bottom of the hierarchy. We all have hierarchical organizations, for better or for worse. It is not the people who are out in the field, right? It's not the responsibility of our people who are doing direct service work and are making the work happen, so to speak. It is not their responsibility because they don't have the time or the space to do it. And adding that onto their plate is not only not fair, but it's also really problematic. And one of the primary reasons why that's problematic is because in social services, right, in human service organizations, we know, especially in urban areas, that the people at the quote bottom of the the organizational hierarchy, we tend to have more women of color at the bottom of our organizational hierarchy, the people out in the field. And as we go higher and higher, leadership tends to get typically whiter and more male, though in our work, we do see quite a bit of women in leadership positions. But we do know statistically that at the top of our agencies, it tends to be whiter, and at the bottom of our agencies, we tend to have more BIPOC individuals, predominantly women. So not only is it problematic to ask those folks to do the work, right, because they're already burdened with the direct service work, but they're also the people who are directly being affected by racist policies and racist practices within the agency. And so this is, again, we come back to the story I tell you of, it is not my job to teach you about your racism, right? It's the same idea. It is not their job to figure out how to undo racist and white supremacist systems within the organization. That doesn't mean that people can't be involved, right? This absolutely can be a team effort, but it is not their responsibility. And so that's to say that it is led from the top, but informed by employees, right? And so everybody can be involved at all levels of the organization, and voices from all levels of the organization should be involved. But that doesn't mean simply asking people for their opinions about how the organization is or is not racist, or what kind of, difficulties people of color are facing in the agency. That's not involvement, right? That is asking people to provide their emotional labor. And so we'll talk a little bit more about what involvement could look like. But I want to really distinguish between those two things. That's not active involvement, simply asking people to describe their experiences so that you as a leader can learn from them. So a racially just organization, as far as leadership in a racially just organization, you are instilling learning as an organizational value. So you are not just saying that we need to continue to learn about the work that we do, the field that we're in, whether it's behavioral health or whatever field, but that learning about these issues is part of who we are as an organization, and that you are going to provide those opportunities on a regular, ongoing, and a regular ongoing basis. And it's not a one-off, right? And it is not something that is considered extra. It's considered, the learning and the growth around this is considered just another part of the job, right? And as a leader, you also just need to have a humble commitment to learning and growth yourself. And I think that is for leaders and for anybody else, right? We all have to practice this work with humility and with a commitment to continuously learning and to continuously growing, and to understand when we may not be doing the right thing, right? So where do we want to be, right? So part of this is thinking about, as leaders, our job is to say, okay, we are here. Where do we want to be with this work? And we create, when we do a strategic plan, say, right? 1 year, 3 year, 5 years down the line, where do we want to be? We're not unfamiliar with this idea of where do we want to be and what this concept looks like. And we need to apply it here too. What does it look like in 1 year, 3 years, and 5 years down the line? What does being a racially just organization actually look like in your specific context? So some things that you need to be thinking about and asking yourself. And the main one that we're going to focus on today is understanding and challenging white supremacy culture, right? But some of the other things you want to think about in the where do we want to be space is that anti-racism principles are inherent in every decision, policy, and practice. That it's just how you, quote, do business, right? That you never actually really even need to consider it. Oh, how do we do this work from a racially just perspective or an anti-racist perspective? That it gets to the point where it is just a part of who you are. And that can seem really daunting because of how we tend to think about and situate the work as something external to the rest of the work that we do as an agency. You want to be nimble and you want to be humble, right? We talk about humility. We can't do this work without a large dose of humility at the leadership level, but I think for everybody in the organization, but also understanding the importance of being nimble, right? That things are how they are because somebody made them that way, and that we can change things whenever we want to, right? The idea that, and we've all heard this before, right? Well, that's just how it is. That's just how we do things. Well, that's not being a humble and nimble organization, right? Being humble and nimble is saying, this is how we do things and we don't really know why, and we don't know if it's necessarily serving us anymore. And we need to figure out how to make that change, and that it is possible because anything can be changed, right? We as people put systems in place to begin with, we can undo those systems. So this idea of it's just this way because it is, because it's always been that way, that is going to really harm, that perspective really harms any work around racial justice and anti-oppressive organizational practices. And some of you may have heard this before, but the concept of being a co-conspirator and not an ally. We often use this language of allyship. When we think about our work or doing anti-racist work from a co-conspirator framework, it means that we are truly immersing ourselves with those who are struggling, right? With those who are experiencing, are the beneficiaries of racism and oppression on a daily basis, right? And engaging in the struggle with them. Being an ally is saying, yes, this work is really important, and I applaud you for doing this work, right? That's an ally saying that you understand that the world should be different. But being a co-conspirator is somebody who takes an active role, right? It's the difference between listening and learning and acting on that listening and learning. So these are 5 ways that I think we can think about where we want to be. But before we can do any of that, we really need to think about the concept of white supremacy culture. And some of you may have thought about this before, done some reading on this, or had some conversations about it, but we're going to spend the rest of our time really focusing on this, because there's no way you can do any of the other stuff without acknowledging the role that white supremacy plays, not just in our world and in our society, but in how our organizations are structured. So I'm going to rely on some work by Tima Okun, who you may have read their work before, but has done some really, really amazing work around thinking about and analyzing the characteristics of white supremacy within organizations specifically. So I just want to read this, and I put the link at the bottom if you're interested in learning more. But white supremacy culture is the widespread ideology baked into the beliefs, values, norms, and standards of our groups, many, if not most of them, our communities, our towns, our states, our nation, teaching us both overtly and covertly that whiteness holds value and that whiteness is value. Whiteness holds value and whiteness is value. I want you to just take that in for a second and think about what that looks like within an organizational context. So, some characteristics of white supremacy culture in organizations. These are the primary ways that we see white supremacy showing up. Oops, I'm sorry. So we've got perfectionism, a sense of urgency, defensiveness, quantity over quality, power hoarding, worship of the written word, paternalism, either or thinking, fear of open conflict, individualism, progress is bigger, more objectivity, and the right to comfort. So take a moment, think about these words, these phrases, and think about how any of these or all of these show up in your work, right? Show up in your organization, show up for you in your role as a leader, show up in the culture of your organization specifically. And they may not all be easily accessed for you, but some of them at least should really stick out as, oh yes, we really focus on that, or that's really important to our agency. And then if you don't mind, do any of these really, which ones really stick out for you? If you can put it in the chat. Any of them that you really feel like are important to the work that of your organization, that are really prevalent within the work of the organization, that really kind of frame the work, or are just part of your culture? Power hoarding, quantity over quality, individualism, the written word, yeah. Fear of open conflict. Absolutely. I think for me personally, the quantity over quality is also, Robin said that, is very much present for me in the work that I do, in terms of the research that I do on organizations. And, you know, the concept of perfectionism, right? What does that mean? What does it mean to be perfect? Why do we strive for perfection? Who gets to decide what that looks like, right? And the concept of progress is bigger. That is, if the more growth we have, the bigger we get, that somehow equates to making progress. So, sorry, my screen is being blocked here. Okay, so some points about this as the concept of white supremacy culture, right? So the characteristics that we just identified, right? The unconscious use of these characteristics as norms and standards, right, is one way that this shows up. That the characteristics that we laid out here, that this is just part of our work. It's part of what we do. It's part of how we are. It's part of how we operate, and we don't question it, right? A lot of this just is built into the work that we do, and it's built into organizational structures, whether it's nonprofit or for-profit, right? This is kind of how we see our work getting done, and that there's really no other way, right? So it's the norms and standards that our organizations are built on, and that it's difficult, if not impossible, to create space for other cultural norms and standards, right? That there's no room for any other way of thinking, right? That this is just how it is. And we talked about that briefly before, this idea of this is how it is, this is how it's always been, this is how it gets done, right? Well, that doesn't leave room for other types of perspectives, right? Other types of models, other types of systems to come in to maybe think about what it would be like to do things differently, right? And when we say we want to be a multicultural or anti-racist organization, but we only allow other people and cultures to come in if they adapt or conform to already existing cultures or norms, well, that's not actually creating a multicultural or anti-racist organization, right? It means that you're either in or you're out, right? You conform to this or you don't. And if you don't, then you are likely not going to be effective, be successful, or continue where you are, right? Being able to identify and name the cultural norms and standards that you want to have is a first step to making room for a truly multicultural / anti-racist organization, right? So the envisioning process. Well, what does it look like? What are all these look like in our agency? What is serving us and what is not serving us? And what would it look like to do all of these differently, right? What are the alternatives to these characteristics? And if you can't even think of what the alternative might look like because it's so ingrained in the culture of your organization, then you know that these are really problematic, right? The idea of, well, we don't even know what the alternative is, right? So part of thinking about how white supremacy as a construct is acting out and is taking place in your agency is being able to identify the alternative. And when the alternative is not accessible to you, then you know it's really, really problematic. So some questions to ask yourself. And we'll take some time to go through these. And this doesn't address all of the characteristics. These are just some of many questions that we can ask ourselves when we're thinking about how these characteristics play out in our organizations, if they do at all, right? So the concept of perfection, who defines what perfect is and what standards are used to determine perfection? And how have these ideas, these characteristics, impacted our understanding of professionalism, right? We talk a lot about professionalism in our agencies. Who decides what professionalism is? Where does it come from? What does a professional look like? What is our image of a professional? And how do we know when someone is not, quote, behaving professionally, right? Why does everything have to happen yesterday? So this sense of urgency, who determines the need for urgency? And more importantly, who does the urgency serve, right? What do we get out of operating from this place of this needed to happen yesterday? Why do we get defensive when challenging commonly held beliefs or ideas? How does defensiveness maintain power? What is the result of emphasizing performance measurement and outcomes? Who wins and who loses? And how does this impact BIPOC staff in particular? Right? When we focus so much on performance measurement and outcomes, and we create what in a lot of ways winds up being arbitrary standards for what performance is, and the majority of our staff, in some cases, those who are actually on the ground doing the work wind up being women of color, right? Then these performance measurements, these random performance measurements and outcomes, arbitrary, that are often unattainable in a lot of ways, or not attainable without something else suffering, winds up impacting our staff of color more significantly than those at the top. Do those who make decisions understand the needs of those they're making decisions for? And do those who have decisions made for them understand how and why decisions are made? Right? This is related to questions of power. Who has it, how, and why? And why is power concentrated so heavily at the top? Who gets to access the power? And why do we believe that those in power know best? So what do we gain by valuing individual success over collective success? Who benefits from this? And why does bigger mean better? How does this reinforce some of the other characteristics of white supremacy? So I want to go back now and asking some of those questions, that look at these characteristics and think about what, if you were to ask questions like that, right, about all of these, what do you come up with, right? What comes to mind for you? You can put it in the chat or you don't have to. It's just more of a opportunity for you to take stock a little bit. Now, one of the things that people ask is, well, why are these considered characteristics of white supremacy culture and not just organizational culture or productivity culture, right? Well, the reason why this would be considered white supremacy culture is because who created these standards? These are standards that have been created and handed down from those who have power, right? And those in power have historically been those with racial privilege and those with gender privilege, right? And so when we think about these characteristics as not just simply being about work culture, organizational culture, or productivity culture, but thinking about them in terms of characteristics of white supremacy, right? When we are creating organizations that adhere to these characteristics, and these characteristics have been created by those who have power, then it is easier to see how these characteristics and the way they play out in organizations actually serve to maintain these systems of power that are rooted in white supremacy, right? And our history, as we talk about our history, we know that our entire history is based on this concept of white supremacy, right? That certain people have power just because they do, right? Because they are entitled to it based on their race. And those are the folks who have created these systems. And those are the ones who continue to perpetuate these systems as the way that we need to do business. So while it may not feel like these characteristics are explicitly based in overt white supremacist thinking, when you break it down and peel the layers back a little bit, it's easier to start to understand, well, these systems that we're told we just have to do it this way, right, are actually rooted in systems of power with goals of maintaining that power. And as long as we continue to create our organizations from these frameworks, then we are essentially reproducing these systems of white supremacy and of racially unjust practices and policies. So that's a lot to kind of take in and to wrap your head around, I think. At least it is for me, even though I talk about this all the time, it still feels very heavy and like a lot to really kind of take in. So the question that I often get is, well, okay, as leadership, we acknowledge this, we understand this, or we're starting to, well, what do we do, right? So there's a lot of things you can do. And again, you're not going to learn all the things that you can do in one webinar today, but some things to think about, right? So as individual leaders, right, you yourself as an individual, take stock of how these characteristics are showing up and operate in your organization. And when I mean take stock, don't just think about it, right? Don't just say, oh, okay, yeah, like we named like defensiveness or worship of the written word or progress. These are things that we know we experience on a day-to-day basis. Well, sit with that for a little bit. What does that look like? How does it impact your work, right? How do you as a leader then use this framework, right? These characteristics. How do you put that onto other people? How do you expect people below you in leadership positions to put that onto their team? And when these characteristics are not being upheld or maintained, what do we see that as problematic, right? What are our responses to that, right? So really kind of thinking about it and taking stock of it, not just in how they show up, but how do they operate and what do they do for you? How are they serving you? And how may they not be serving you in terms of the actual goals of your organization and what you're trying to do? As a leadership team, have ongoing and planned discussions about how characteristics of white supremacy show up within the organization, with other members of the team. Create space for this conversation to start and to continue, again, as part of your work, not an add-on, not an extra, not something that happens after work, over happy hour or, wherever, but as part of your day, as part of your week, right? And then once those conversations are happening, how are you going to work with staff to broaden those conversations, to bring other people in, right? To have individual and collective reflection and discussion about the way these characteristics show up in the organization. This is very different than asking people to fill out a survey about their experiences of racism in the organization, or how they have been victims, perhaps, or how these things how racism has been perpetrated, right? Again, that is emotional labor. Asking people to think about the ways that these characteristics are showing up in your agency on a day-to-day basis and how they impact them and how they perpetuate them is a very different conversation than asking people to reflect on the ways that they've been harmed. And this opens a very different conversation, or opens the door to a very different conversation that can continue and can be ongoing. So, what are some common mistakes? Well, you've all heard me say this before. The rushing of the process. Undoing 400 years of racial injustice takes time. And again, we may never achieve that. And one of the biggest mistakes we make is adhering to these characteristics of white supremacy, right? I needed this done yesterday, right? Because we need to make sure that we are, on the right side of history, so to speak, that we are not continuing to perpetuate these mistakes and these injustices, because not only is it not okay, but we're going to be called out on it, right? We are now in a space and time where you will get called out on this. So we have there's this need and this feeling of, we need to get this done now. I needed this done yesterday. Well, there's no way to actually make that happen. I wish there was. We cannot undo 400 years of racial injustice by simply having a couple of meetings, or by consulting, we're over 13 minutes. Thanks, Wanjiru. I'm sorry. We are almost done. Reproducing white supremacy, using characteristics and tools of white supremacy to do the actual anti-racism work. You do not want to do anti-racism work in the same way that white supremacy actually gets perpetuated in the organization. And quitting when things get hard, it's important work, and it's something that is very, very difficult to do, and it's really easy to quit when things get difficult. So commit, don't quit, right? Progress, not perfection. There's no product to be produced and delivered. It's going to be hard, but if you commit to it, then you will see progress over time. Thank you.